Sometimes I just kind of hate that I'm an addict. Sometimes it just really, really sucks. I'm listening to Susan's workshop on 2 of the new breakthroughs in the science of sustainable weight loss. It's a webinar she put out for Bright Lifers only, so it's part of the Bright Line Eating membership. I'm struggling. I'm only about 17 minutes into this 2-hour workshop. The problem for me is that I also have ADHD, and everything she's saying about the science around addiction, you could take the word addiction out and just replace it with ADHD, and she'd be saying the same things. Prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, impulse control, dopamine downregulation. It's all one and the same for me. So I kind of feel like someone with ADHD who is an addict, I have a double whammy with a lot of it. And then another part of the problem is that because I have ADHD, it's really hard for me to hang in there for the solution. And I often just stick around long enough for the part that's eye-catching, that's interest-piquing, which is the problems. And then my brain starts kind of zoning out. And so what happens is a pattern of being very aware of all the problems and not being aware of any of the solutions. And this is an ongoing issue, right? Anytime I start reading a book about ADHD, I only get as far in as reading the problems. And then my ADHD kicks in and I don't read the solutions. So when I started Bright Line Eating, that was probably the first time I read a book to the end. And I didn't read it all the way to the end. I read most of it and then I threw the book across the room when I got to the part about the solutions. The solutions being no sugar, no flour, weighing and measuring your meals, and not eating between meals. I threw the book across the room because it seemed too hard. The only reason I picked it back up is because my husband and I had an argument and he was like, "You're going to finish what you started because I'm sick of you not finishing what you start. And here's a book that you spent money on and I want you to finish it." It was arbitrary. He didn't care about the subject matter of the book. He was like, "You bought the book, dang it, you're going to finish the book." And so I did, because of the pressure, which if you have ADHD, you know, we need the pressure. We need some fire under our butt. We need motivation in order to accomplish things. Way more than the average person. Somehow when I got into Bright Line Eating, I had the perfect mix of it being a novelty, having hit a true rock bottom of just hellish experience with my weight and my health and my lack of self-control around my food. So that was enough of a motivator. And being involved enough in social media that I was getting seen, and so keeping track of what I ate was a novelty. Do you see how it was almost the perfect culture? If you think about like a little petri dish has a culture for growing bacteria, I happen to be in the perfect culture to foster my Bright Line Eating journey. And I learned the solutions along the way. I did not start with all the information. I started with just enough information for me to get by. And so sometimes I sit here, you know, living the dream, living the success story, right? Like I've lost over 77 pounds and I've kept it off. I'm, end of February is going to be 3 years in Bright Line Eating without a single line break. That's me counting my chickens before they hatch. And yet I'm still an addict. I'm still someone with ADHD, and I am still someone who just gets so incredibly overwhelmed and frustrated by the odds that we're up against. That overwhelm is just dizzying. My 10-year-old explained it really well to me in the car when he said, "Mom, when I know I'm about to have a nightmare, you know that scene in Madagascar where the lion gets shot with a tranquilizer dart? And then that song comes on, who can take a sunrise?" Anyway, if you don't know it, go watch it. How it all starts like swirling and you can't really see what's going on and it turns into a kaleidoscope. He's like, "That's when I know I'm about to have a nightmare, as if that happens in my dream." I couldn't pick a better picture to explain what overwhelm looks like for someone with ADHD or for someone with addiction. We are so disoriented that me looking at that rowing machine wouldn't even look like a rowing machine. It looks like a kaleidoscope, little diamonds and things swirling around. We don't even see it. And so when we pick up the drink, when we pick up the food, there's no choice in that. It's not even a choice. And we're so naive to think once we get sober, we're like, "Oh, I got this. I can see clearly." And so what do? We take off our sobriety glasses and think, "I got this." And what happens is we start seeing the kaleidoscope again and it stops being within our control. I have not broken my lines with food. Thank God. Like, really, that is a God thing. But I go back and forth with caffeine all the time because my why around caffeine is not strong enough. And once I've got some time under my belt, I forget. I forget the effects of it. I forget the inflammation. I forget the effects of it on my gut. I forget how it affects my sleep. I forget the spikes and the crashes. I forget how it escalates for me. I forget all of it. It all goes out the window, and it's all clear as day if I am wearing my sobriety glasses. It's just a no-brainer. And so this is why I always laugh when people are like, oh, you have a crystal vase, you haven't broken your lines, it must be so easy for you, and you're so lucky, and all that. Like, bullshit. I'm sorry. Like, no, absolutely not. We work hard at keeping our lines bright, and there are conditions that have made it favorable, sure, but we are still addicts, and I struggle with that. I have other buddies. What do they struggle with? It could be anything. It could be bubbly water. It could be binge watching Netflix shows. It could be spending. It could any number of things. It might be a substance. It might be a process. It might be being addicted to their own health game and like tweaking their program and trying this cleanse and taking this test and getting too much information. Addict brain sucks. And sometimes I just feel a lot like the kid I grew up with who had a physical disability. And when the whole youth group would be playing dodgeball, he would be sitting in a corner crying because there was just no way he could play dodgeball. He couldn't do it. He couldn't get out of the wheelchair. He couldn't wheel the wheelchair around fast enough. No one could push his wheelchair around fast enough for him to be enjoying himself. And it was just tragic. And you know he'd sit there and be like, this sucks. But I know that when that kid was around other kids that had spina bifida and he was doing things with a community of people who were overcoming disabilities, that there was an empowerment and a flame in his eyes, and he knew he could do it, and he knew he had a quality of life and a reason to live and a purpose in this world. And that, my friend, is why we need community. We need community because especially this time of year, holidays are the worst because you spend your time around a bunch of neurotypical people. I think neurodiversity applies to addiction, not just ADHD, autism, bipolar, depression, anxiety. Those are all things that make you neurodiverse. Your neurology is different, neurodiversity. I think addiction is just as much a qualifier of neurodiversity. So those of us who have neurodiversity, we get to a time of year where we're spending a lot of time with neurotypical people who are able to do neurotypical things, whose brains don't react the same way as ours. And we're sitting there on the sideline watching everyone else play dodgeball and saying, I can't play this game. And the reality is, I don't have a fun, pithy answer for you. I don't have a mantra that's going to make it all better. I don't have an analogy for you on this one. Sometimes it just sucks to be an addict, and that's okay. Sometimes you realize you're a pickle and everyone else is a cucumber still. And yes, there are lots of good things about being a pickle. We're salty, we're crunchy, we're well preserved. Like, our longevity is greater. You don't have to be in the refrigerator to stay fresh. Like, there's so much about a pickle that is better than a cucumber. And yet, sometimes you just want a cucumber. But once a pickle, always a pickle. I spend a lot of time in my head with analogies. Like, it's kind of just how my brain works. I'm a very visual thinker. And so sometimes, here's another one for you. Sometimes I wish I were a dandelion. Sometimes I wish I could just grow through a crack in the pavement. I wish I could just spring up with no soil whatsoever and have this robust root that goes so deep that even when someone tries to pull me out, that root is there. And if you try and pull me out, I'm going to grow twice as strong. And I'm going to spread seeds everywhere. And I'm going to come back 100-fold. I wish I had that resiliency, but I don't. I am a frickin' orchid. Orchids can't grow in the ground. Their roots will rot. Orchids grow on the side of a tree. They need another living thing in order to exist. Orchids grow in a very specific climate. If they're too close to the sun, they get sunburnt. They need bright shade. Orchids need humidity, but not moisture. Orchids need their roots to be exposed. Is any of this sounding familiar? Is any of this sounding like addiction recovery? Like, we need community. We need others. We need someone who's thriving in which to grow on, and we can't hide our roots. We have to show them. We have to show them. We have to expose them to the air. We have to expose them to the light. We need to photosynthesize more than most. And if we get a drink in the crown of our plant, we're done. We're going to rot just like an orchid would. I don't know if you knew that. In the plant itself, if water gets left in that plant, it's essentially done for. It's just going to rot because the plant grows sideways. It doesn't even grow up and down. It only grows sideways. And anytime it rains, the water does not stay on the leaves. It falls right off. I feel like sometimes I'm an orchid who's trying to grow up and down and trying to grow in the ground, and it doesn't work, and I wish I were a dandelion, but I'm not. But then every once in a while, I look over to the left and I see another orchid in full bloom. And if you have ever had any houseplant that you've had for an amount of time and then it starts to bloom and you're like, I did that, it's blooming, right? Like that feeling, as opposed to buying it from the store already in bloom, but like making a plant bloom, there is nothing like that feeling. So as I look over and see someone who's been in food addiction recovery for 7 to 10 years, and I see how magnificently they're running their program, how stable they are, how strong their roots are, how exposed they are, how much they wrap around the trunk of the tree, how horizontal their plant is and not even trying to be vertical, how shaded it is from the sun, how they are relying on others and having their program exposed. And I see them in full bloom and I say, that's where I'm supposed to be. So maybe this is the analogy. It's time to stop looking at the dandelions, because you're not a dandelion. You are an orchid. And no one looks at an orchid in full bloom and says, oh, well, of course the orchid's blooming. I mean, have you seen the conditions it has? And I mean, have you seen how much this one's been babied and how much it's been pampered? No. What do we say when we see an orchid in bloom? Even at the grocery store. Let's be honest. You go in the flower aisle at the grocery store and you see the orchids. It's like, whoa, that's magnificent. Full stop. What's magnificent is when we accept who we are, what we are, why we are. We embrace it and we live up to our potential, not someone else's. I am an orchid. I am not a dandelion, and that is okay.